Right. Thank you so much, Walter. And it's so nice to see everyone. And thank you all for taking the time out of your busy days to come. I know this is a crazy time in the semester. And I'm really glad I got the chance to do the brown bag. So thank you, Walter, because this is a book I'm working on, and I haven't presented anything on this chapter. And so the book I'm working on is called The Lost Princess: Women Writers in the History of Classical Fairy Tales. So this is what my talk's coming out of. In the book, I reposition women fairy tale writers, especially Marie-Catherine d'Aulnoy, with respect to our notion of what we consider to be classic or canonical fairy tales. When people think of fairy tales, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, and Snow White often come to mind as being traditional tales that have been told for centuries. However, these tales by Perrault and the Grimms did not dominate the field of fairy tales in the past as they do today. And we often do not realize the fact that the canon of fairy tales changes in every age, ours being largely defined by Disney. From the 1690s through the early 20th century in France, Germany, and England, the fairy tale writer Marie-Catherine d'Aulnoy enjoyed the status that Charles Perrault, the Brothers Grimm, and Hans Christian Andersen have today. Her tales impacted generations of artists, and this talk considers the legacy of one of her tales, The Green Serpent, in French literary culture, British pantomime, and French classical music. Each chapter of the book examines the legacies of different tales to try to hint at the extent to which tales by d'Aulnoy and other women fairy tale writers were indeed ubiquitous in pre-20th century Europe. The chapter this talk is taken from examines d'Aulnoy's role in shaping what will become the canonical Beauty and the Beast tale by Jean-Marie Le Prince de Beaumont. It follows two of d'Aulnoy's tales, The Ram and The Green Serpent, with respect to their impact on the formation of Beauty and the Beast, and with respect to their continued legacy. They did not simply disappear with the appearance of Beauty and the Beast, but they indeed coexisted and continued to be published and adapted through the early 20th century. First published in 1697, The Green Serpent is a rewriting of Cupid and Psyche at the same time that it prepares the way for Beauty and the Beast tales. And I just want to give a summary of the tale, and then we'll look at its legacy. So the tale opens with a scene reminiscent of Perrault's Sleeping Beauty. A disgruntled, older and ugly fairy Magotine intrudes upon a banquet to which other fairies were invited to bestow their gifts upon the twin daughters of a queen and a king. Because she had not been invited, Magotine curses the eldest twin to become uglier and uglier with age. The parents end up naming the accursed princess Laidronette, which means little ugly one, and her younger twin Bellotte, or Little Beauty. Aware of her ugliness, Laidronette first retreats from court life to the castle of solitary ones, which could be read as a figure for the convent, a space with which d'Aulnoy was all too familiar given the forced sequestrations she endured in her life. During an outing, Laidronette sees the Green Serpent, who later wishes to help her when her boat floats away from shore, but she's terrified of the beastly hero. The boat capsizes, and unbeknownst to her, Laidronette is saved by the Green Serpent. So she kind of passes out, he saves her, and he takes her to his luxurious palace, staffed by little animated Chinese figurines, which she calls pagodes. And that's one illustration of her text. While at the palace, Laidronette enjoys plays by famous French playwrights like Molière. She attends balls and she reads. However, what most pleases her are her conversations with an unknown invisible lover who in reality is the Green Serpent. As such, the hero's character is doubled, and we see this doubling in later versions of Beauty and the Beast, but we won't get into that here. Although Laidronette fears the Green Serpent, she's comforted by her own unknown lover, Her invisible king recounts how the fairy Magotine, the same fairy, condemned him to a penance of 7 years, 5 of which have already passed, and he asked Ledronette to marry him, but she cannot look upon him or he will have to start his penance all over again, and she would have to join him in this penance. Ledronette agrees and marries him, but then she reads the story about Cupid and Psyche, which instead of serving as a warning to her about what she should not do, it leads her instead to repeat Psyche's mistakes. The story of Psyche thus sparks her desire to visit her family, setting into motion her momentary downfall. During her visit with her mother and sister, Ledronette reveals to them, just like Psyche, the fact that she has never actually seen her husband, and her mother and sister urge her to gaze upon him, not out of jealousy, as in the case of Psyche's sisters, but out of true concern for her well-being, fearing that her husband may indeed be a monster. Based on her reading of Psyche's story, Ledronette insists to her mother and sister, no, my husband is probably the god of love, he's going to be handsome. But upon her return home, fueled by her fatal curiosity, she gazes upon her husband, hoping to see Cupid, but in an ironic twist, she cries out in horror upon seeing the green serpent instead. Several other adventures and trials occur. They have to go through the penance all over again. And a lot of these trials are inspired by Cupid and Psyche until finally Ledronette is transformed into the beautiful, discreet queen, and the green serpent is returned to his original handsome form. So the green serpent made its mark on French literary culture, British pantomime, and French classical music. And this is something no one's really talked about. Like many of Donnois' tales, the green serpent circulated in widely popular collections of tales by Donnois in French and in English. And this slide is just her publications in the 18th century. So you can see that she was constantly being republished. And that's not 19th century. So the same thing is happening later on. She was actually published more than Perrault in the 18th century in England. And this particular tale, among several others, also circulated in chapbook form in France and as an individual tale. Honoré de Balzac, Gustave Flaubert, and the lesser-known poet Robert de Bonnières all reference the green serpent in their correspondence and works. Adapted to the British stage in pantomime form, which combines theater, music, and ballet, the tale's musical legacy culminated in the work of Maurice Ravel in the early 20th century. While critics like Melvin Palmer and Jennifer Shacker, they've done amazing work, and they've observed the influence that Donnois had on writers like Anne Radcliffe, Maria Edgeworth, and Anne Thackeray Ritchie, few have pointed out Donnois' mark on French literature beyond the domain of fairy tales. However, with a little digging, there are some notable examples, and more excavation work could very well reveal a broader impact than I am suggesting here. Balzac, for instance, references the 37-volume of old regime fairy tales, Le Cabinet des Fées, with a particular emphasis on Donnois' fairy tales in an 1823 work, The Last Fairy. The story concerns the young nature child Abel, who, quote, admired the green serpent, Gracieuse et Percinet, and the Bluebeard, and these are all Donnois tales. His mother fabricates for him an outfit based on a print of Prince Charming, and he was 1,000 times handsomer than Percinet, Gracieuse's beloved. And I think what a lot of these, they might look like side marks in these texts, but what I think they reveal is these are common references for Balzac's readers as well. They know what it means for him to be handsomer than Percinet. Over 20 years later, in his short story, A Prince of Bohemia, Balzac draws specifically from the green serpent as a framing device. He has the character Nathan declare, as he attentively listens to Madame de la Baudry's account of an affair between a count and an opera dancer, quote, I'm listening to you like a child whose mother is telling him the story of the great green serpent. Ellen Pascoe remarks that Donnois' tale had recently been re-edited in 1835, and then makes the connection between the fairy tale and the short story, which also concerns, according to Pascoe, broken marriages which will shortly be reconciled, and the benefits gained from the difficulties afflicting the wives while they were separated from their husbands. And we have to remember, Laidronette is going to go through years of penance before she reunites with her husband, just like Psyche. For Pasco, Balzac deploys this marvelous tale to frame the message of his realistic short story, which might speak to Balzac's familiarity with Donois' oeuvre. Stylistically, Donois framed her fairy tales with realistic novellas, and she played on the relation between the realistic frame narrative and the marvelous tales interpolated within it. Here, Balzac takes the opposite approach, whereby the reference to the marvelous fairy tale about the trials of Laidronette that eventually led to her success and reunion with her husband frames the realistic story in which the opera dancer Claudine succeeds in the trials put to her by her lover, the Comte de la Palferine. Balzac was not alone among 19th century authors who appreciated Donois, and although not as integral to their works as in the case of A Prince of Bohemia, other writers indirectly or directly referenced the Green Serpent as well. In 1853, while Flaubert was working on Madame Bovary, the novelist penned a letter to his friend Louis Bouillet, in which he seems to console himself from the apparently dreary work of writing Madame Bovary by reading Donois' fairy tales. Quote, I read the Bluebird by Donois the day before yesterday. It's so pretty. What a shame one cannot grasp all of this. This would be more amusing to write than the discourse of a pharmacist. The bourgeois foulness in which I'm trudging fills me with gloom. 3 days earlier, in a letter to his muse and lover, Louise Collet, Flaubert had already expressed his fondness for Donois' tales. Quote, presently, I'm reading the children's tales of Madame Donois in an old edition, whose pages I colored when I was 6 or 7. The dragons are pink and the trees blue. There's one page where everything is colored red, even the sea. They really amuse me, these tales. The tale he reminisced about coloring all red could well be The Green Serpent, a digitized image of which can be found at the University of Rouen, along with 4 other images from Donois' tales that Flaubert colored and preserved as a child. Evidenced in this correspondence, Donois' tales, including The Green Serpent, play an interesting role in the creative process of Madame Bovary. The marvelous aristocratic world of Madame Donois serves as a counterpart to and refuge from the dreary bourgeois world of Madame Bovary. Whereas Flaubert reflects upon his childhood attachments to Donois' fairy tales in a gesture of personal nostalgia, the Goncourt brothers express a more general cultural nostalgia for her pre-revolutionary tales. In History of French Society During the Revolution, first published in 1854, the celebrated critics, novelists, and historians Edmond and Jules de Goncourt discuss the ways in which the tales of Donois became targets of the revolutionaries' reactions to aristocratic society. After lamenting the revolutionary rejection of opera, the brothers turned to discuss a similar reaction that occurred to fairy tales, declaring, quote, it was in a royalist joke of 1792 that fairy tales were unennobled. No more kings, queens, beautiful princesses, or valorous knights. The green serpent is now the tricolored serpent, green being the color of the aristocrats. Tricolored, of course, refers to the blue, white, and red of the revolutionary flag. That the tale of the green serpent is singled out among a few others speaks to its popularity in 18th and 19th century French culture. Later in the century, the journalist, novelist, and poet Robert de Bonnières opens his 1881 collection of fairy poems with a short introduction, which assumes his readers' familiarity with the tales mentioned, which again includes the green serpent. Quote, at that time lived King Charming, the green serpent, and my dear Florine, and in her tower asleep for 100 years was still sleeping beauty. It was the time of fairy palaces, of bluebirds, of glass slippers, long tales during the long winter eves. King Charming and Florine are characters from Donois' The Bluebird, and with the reference to the green serpent, Bonnières clearly puts Donois' tales on par with those of Perrault. The original poems that follow are influenced by both Daunois and Perrault, with strong female figures appearing throughout. Although not well known today, Bonnière was a lifelong friend of Guy de Maupassant and frequented impressionists and writers like Anatole France and André Gide. These references to the Green Serpent in particular, and to Daunois tales in general by 19th century writers, clearly demonstrate that Daunois fairy tales were common currency. The fact that a tale like the Green Serpent was eventually set to music then should come as no surprise. The earliest record I found of Daunois' Green Serpent being adapted to music occurs in England in the works of James Robinson Blanchet, one of the most significant figures in the history of 19th century stage. Blanchet notably was fluent in French, being of French Huguenot extraction. In 1856, he produced a translation of 22 tales by Daunois. Along with tales by Perrault, like Puss in Boots and Bluebeard, Blanchet adapted several Daunois tales to the stage, and these are the tales that he adapted, sometimes not under the same title, sometimes not immediately attributed to Daunois, but these include The White Cat, Belle Belle or The Chevalier Fortuné, The Fair One with the Golden Locks, Gracieuse et Percinet, and The Green Serpent. Based on The Green Serpent and starring Ledronetta, his fairy extravaganza, The Island of Jewels, was first performed at the Royal Lyceum's Theatre on December 26, 1849. It ran for 135 nights, being, quote, among the most famous of his fairy musicals, which speaks to the degree to which Victorian audiences were familiar with this particular tale by Daunois, among others. So keep in mind, we're only following one tale, and I could have written a book of thousands of pages anyway. As in the tradition of British pantomime and French vaudeville féerie, Blanchet takes a playful approach to his material, which is set in verse and punctuated by musical airs, at the same time that Blanchet grounds the extravaganza in British culture. For instance, in lyrics set to the music of In Queste Semplice from the recent opera by Gaetano Donizetti, Batley or the Swiss Chalet, which premiered in 1836, Blanchet compares the situation of Ledronetta to that of Robinson Crusoe. References in the script are also made to King Lear, as well as to the English nursery rhyme, Jack and Jill. Interpolated into the extravaganza is a ballet based on Cupid and Psyche. Thus, instead of having his heroine, as in Daunois, simply read Cupid and Psyche's story, Blanchet sets it to music and dance within the extravaganza setting, that is, creating a play within the play. The relation of the Green Serpent to music history is quite different in its home country. Although there were vaudeville fairy musicals performed in 19th century Paris that drew from tales by Daunois, and I have another chapter that focuses a lot more on the pantomimes and the French vaudeville musicals. The Green Serpent, to my knowledge, was not adapted to the musical stage, yet it inspired several musical pieces. In 1860, René Bayot, a professor at the Paris Conservatory, published a score titled The Green Serpent, Dancer for the piano. However, the most famous musical adaptation of the tale was undoubtedly that of Maurice Ravel, whose 1908 Mother Goose suite included scenes from Perrault's Sleeping Beauty and Little Thumbling, Daunois' Green Serpent, and Le Prince de Beaumont's Beauty and the Beast. Initially a set of piano duets, the suite eventually evolved into what became a popular ballet in the 1910s. Following in the footsteps of Ravel, Jean-Michel Damas later recorded Féerie, which included a piece, The Green Serpent, among seven others inspired by Daunois. So there were 8 Daunois tales, and then Perrault with one tale by Le Prince de Beaumont. The evolution of Ravel's suite is quite interesting. As Emily Kilpatrick has documented, quote, in the early autumn of 1908, Maurice Ravel spent several days in Vadevin babysitting 2 young children, Mimi and Jean Godebski. They were the children of Ravel's close friends, Ida and Sipa, a Polish couple whose salon at the Rue d'Athènes gathered well-known musicians of the period, including French composer Claude Debussy, Spanish composer Manuel de Falla, and Russian composer Igor Stravinsky, among others. Ravel used to read fairy tales to the Gobetsky children, as Mimi later recollected. Quote, of all my parents' friends, I had a predilection for Ravel because he used to tell me stories I loved. I used to climb on his knee and indefatigably he would begin Once Upon a Time. And it would be Laidronette or La Belle et la Bête, or especially The Adventures of a Poor Mouse he made up for me. Between 1908 and 1910, Ravel composed 5 piano duets forming the Mother Goose Suite, based on Mimi and Jean's favorite fairy tales, which was first performed in Paris in 1910. In 1911, Ravel adapted the piano pieces to create a symphony titled Mother Goose 5 Children's Pieces Suite for Orchestra. Kilpatrick nicely summarizes the suite's narrative arc. For Petit Poucet, he chose a passage from near the beginning of the tale as the heroine and his brothers begin their wanderings. The passage quoted for Laidronette is taken from near the midpoint of her story when, having crossed the sea, she takes a bath accompanied by an orchestra of pagodes and pagodines, the little Chinese figurines. The epigraph to Les Entretiens de la Belle et la Bête leads us towards the crux of our tale and theirs, the beast seeming death and his magical transformation into a handsome prince. The suite found its final incarnation as a ballet in 1912, Mother Goose, one-act ballet, 5 tableaus, and an apotheosis, performed at the Théâtre des Arts in Paris on January 28, 1912, in collaboration with theater director Jacques Rouchet, stage designer Jacques Dreza, and choreographer Jean Hugard. In producing the ballet, Ravel integrated a prelude and 4 interludes that frame the tale vignettes. Moreover, the narrative arc was modified, with the Beauty and the Beast vignette coming before the one based on the Green Serpent. So he kind of switched the order. So this is the suite is going to conclude with the Green Serpent and then the apotheosis. Well, Danoise certainly plays on the exoticism of the Orient in her tale by making the pagodes form the court around Laidronette. Ravel and his team further accentuate it. This is evident in Desa's design for Laidronette's costume, as well as in the musical composition itself. Deborah Maurer observes, quote, exoticism is most obviously embedded in the energetic and at times very forthright Laidronette. She explains that Ravel draws from Javanese and more generally Asian music based on the pentatonic scale to compose the music for Laidronette. Danoise's French tale was thus Danoise's French tale with a dash of Asian flavor becomes more fully Oriental in Ravel's hands. And I just wanted to give you a sense of the performance and what the music sounds like. I'm just going to play a minute. And what I think is exciting is that this is being done in Seattle in 2021. So Laidronette still lives on in America. And here we go. So I'm just going to play like the first minute and a half or so. Okay, I'll stop it there. And there's actually a really cool cartoon. Someone put Ravel's suite, just the Ladronette, and animated it. And so if you look that up, it's quite cool. Okay, so back to my PowerPoint. So again, here's the costume from that performance in. Oh wait, sometimes this. Let me see. I'm going to try to share this again. Sometimes it doesn't behave. Okay. So that the suite in general and the ballet in particular focus on a scene in which Ladronette unrobes to bathe, and the quote from Don Juan's tale around which the vignette is built begins with, quote, "She undressed and climbed into the bath," elicits an erotic tone, which is particularly striking in what is originally a tale about an ugly princess. Is it this infusion of Orientalism and artistic movement that often objectified Eastern women for the consumption of Western men that led to the eroticization of the heroine? Besides the design of Ladronette's costume by Dreza, there are no known images of the performance, of these performances. However, in Ravel's partition, he describes Ladronette, quote, "dressed as a Chinese woman in the style of Boucher, a black velour mask concealing her face, a tulip in her hand." The evocation of paintings of François Boucher, known for his voluptuous nudes, only foregrounds the erotic nature of the scene, suggesting that it is only Ladronette's face that is ugly. Her face can be pleasurably contemplated like a figure from a Boucher painting, which only takes on more meaning when we imagine that during the performance, the audience gazes upon the body of the ballet dancer incarnating a bathing Ladronette. In 1910, some 2 years before the appearance of the ballet, René Chaloux, an important music critic of the period, penned a poem directly inspired by Ravel's Green Serpent vignette, also titled after Ravel, Ladronette, Empress of the Pagodes. The poem fully exploits the implicit eroticism of the original suite. Indeed, the first section of the poem reads like a striptease. Ladronette, Empress of the Pagodes, undresses and climbs into the bath. She first removes her dress, her beautiful satin dress, whose long train trails behind on the stairs and the bushy paths, so far behind her that the négrillon who carries it is nothing but a dot in the horizon. She then removes her velour corset, her brocatelle petticoat, and her lace stay shirt. Then, shivering from being naked, with her bare foot, pink as a flower, she touches the water contained in the crystal bathing tub and plunges herself into the sudden freshness. As depicted by Ravel and Chaloux, it is hard to imagine that the heroine was so horribly ugly that her family would have removed her from her sister Bellette's wedding, which is what happens in Don Juan's original tale. Moreover, in her tale, Don Juan pairs up an ugly heroine and hero, both of whom become beautiful as well as good together over the course of the tale, creating a gendered equality between women and men when it comes to imagining goodness, ugliness, beauty, and the pleasurable contemplation of a beautiful person. In Don Juan's tales, there's a lot of females gazing at males and vice versa. So there's kind of egalitarian gaze. Ravel and Chaloux, however, refocus the tale exclusively on female beauty within a more fully Orientalist setting. As such, their adaptations of the Green Serpent also evoke Orientalist paintings like Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres's The Turkish Bath, so this association of Orientalism in the bath, and Jean-Léon Gérôme's The Great Bath at Bursa, complete with nudes and the enslaved Black servants. In the ballet score, it is noted that Green Serpent comes crawling lovingly beside his Ladronette, and given the Orientalist setting, the snake in Ravel is further suggestive of a sexual imagery that is not emphasized in the original tale by Don Juan. Ravel's suite and Chaloux's poem inspired by it both honor Don Juan's legacy, at the same time that they undermine her conception of gender relations, given their objectification of the female body through the sexualization of l'aidronette. A final musical iteration of The Green Serpent can be found in the work of French composer Jean-Michel Damas. Damas was well known in the mid-20th century, having collaborated with Raymond Queneau on his ballet, The Diamond Cruncher, and with Orson Welles on the ballet, The Lady in the Ice, and with Jean Anouilh, who wrote the libretto for Damas's opera Eurydice. Following Ravel's footsteps, Damas recorded Féerie, a collection of short pieces in 1958, which brings together 16 songs based on French fairy tales, as I mentioned above, mostly by Perrault and Dandois, almost split evenly between the two of them. Damas's Green Serpent in particular, and Féerie in general, represents a tribute to Ravel's L'aidronette, Empress of the Pagodas, and his Mother Goose suite. So from Balzac to Damas, The Green Serpent has left its traces on French literature, British pantomime, and classical music. Dandois' fairy tale has been used to frame a realistic story, console Flaubert, as he writes Madame Bovary, and inspire musical and poetic pieces. While some of these adaptations indeed prove to be problematic in their representations not only of gender, but also in the age of imperialism, of race, and the Oriental other, they also speak to the enduring legacy of The Green Serpent and its adaptability to different socio-historical and ideological contexts and to different artistic mediums. This history of one of Dandois' fairy tales, and she's got, I can't remember if it's 30. This history of just one of Dandois' fairy tales gives us only a glimpse into the broader cultural impact of her work in Europe. As the other chapters in the book show, Dandois' tales were founded books for adults and children in France, in Germany, and in Czech Republic. They were adapted to various mediums, including stage, music, comic books, board games, puzzles, and you have an example on the left. That's a puzzle children were supposed to cut out of a newspaper, and it's wrongly attributed to Perrault, but it's Dandois' Green Serpent, and children can put it together like a puzzle. And Dandois' tales were also used to sell chocolate. This kind of work is important because it pushes us to rethink our perceptions of literary and cultural histories, which have not adequately accounted for the impact women and other marginalized groups have had in the production of national and global cultures. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so if you have any questions or comments, oh, perfect.
Yeah, Janine.
Okay, that was really fascinating. I have a very faint knowledge of Dandois. And so I know this isn't the point of your project, but I wonder if you could talk about her a little bit as a person. You know, what is her, does that particle in her name mean anything as far as her social rank? Is she Parisian? Is she, and also I was wondering if she's connected to the Précieuses. I know that's a little bit, maybe a little early for her, but when you're talking about the gender equality, the whole querelle des femmes. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to hear a little bit more about her. The other thing, this is not even a question so much, just when you were talking about the connection to like a convent tale, mm-hmm. You know, she's writing when Port-Royal is like a huge issue. So I also wonder if she has any connection to Port-Royal and the conflict between them and the monarch. So
she did have conflict with the monarch. So she's coming from, so you kind of have in France, you have an earlier generation of salon women, les précieuses, which kind of starts even as early as 1610. And then Madeleine de Scudéry, who's really important, is writing maybe 1640s through the end of the century. And then you have after Scudéry, you have sort of a generation of novelists like Madame de Lafayette. And Donnois' writing, she starts writing in the 1690s, so at the end of the century. And so she's definitely benefited from all of these other earlier women writers and what I consider early feminism in the mid and later part of the century. She's also a group, so there's a group of fairy tale writers, Murat, Madame de Murat, Mademoiselle de la Force, and Donnois, who are all from the old aristocracy, the noblesse d'épée, so they're kind of from these old prestigious families who economically are going down. And several of these women had issues with arranged marriages. Donnois was married at 13 to a man in his 40s, and had a terrible, there's like all kinds of side stories about how she tried to get her husband convicted of lèse-majesté so he would be killed. And there were times where she had to flee to England and Spain, but we don't exactly know where she was. There's a period of her biography that, there's speculation, but she probably spent time, her mother went to Spain. And her husband was abusive too. So her experience with the convent, she was engaged in salon life, but she was also thrown into convents a lot for her bad behavior. But her husband was, of course, as bad or worse than she was. She had affairs and her husband knew that. So I'm not sure how much she would have been involved in questions related to Port-Royal. Three of these fairy tale writers, Donnois, Murat, and La Force, also were from families that used to be Protestant and had to convert. So she does have, and she has a novel that I've talked about where I think she's criticizing Louis XIV's anti-Protestant position, kind of indirectly by talking about England's anti-Catholic. But I think, so Donnois' idea of the convent would have been very real for her. And she spent, and my colleague at Princeton has been doing amazing archival research the past 5 years on Donnois. And there was speculation. So there was one theory that Donnois was writing her fairy tales in the salon, but he set her writing to a real timeline and got the documents that showed when she was locked up in different places. So there was a point she was locked up in a provincial convent, and then she was at Rue Mouffetard, the whole neighborhood there. She was locked up in a convent there. And so he sort of is switching the discourse to focus a little bit more on how her writing is also related to her confinement. At the same time that there was this virtual community where all these women are writing to each other. I don't know, that was a long answer, but I don't know if that answered it.
Yes, I was sorry, I was just trying to unmute myself and I saw that you had the toddler lock on the Zoom. So no, that's great. Actually, that's that makes a lot of sense. And I think that Protestant connection is really intriguing because, that's going to position her and her family as sort of both outsiders and people who are hiding their real identities if they are, maintaining some of those practices and beliefs at home, which I think probably connects to some of the themes of these fairy tales that she's writing. So yeah, that's thank you.
Yeah, and I know she did have a connection. She was friends with Madame du Noyer, who was a Protestant who left and founded a newspaper in Amsterdam. And so she was connected to, and du Noyer never, she left France because she didn't convert.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
I thought I saw Jennifer Olmsted raise her hand.
Hi,
Yes.
Walter. Actually, I didn't raise my hand, but I was clapping, but I do have questions. And I do have questions. Thank you for that wonderful talk. I actually was not familiar with this tale at all, or with Donnois. So thank you for opening my eyes to that. And I have multiple questions, but well, I'll just start with the first one, and I want to let other people have ask questions too, of course. But one of the things I've noticed in the history of art is that fairy tales show up frequently in the 19th century in British painting and also in German painting, and they're tied to this sort of nationalist, the growth of nationalism and the sense of a national identity, particularly in Germany. But this does not happen in French painting, right? And I noticed too that when we start to see the kind of musical elements that you discussed, that happens in England first. I mean, it's a French, writer, right? But I'm not sure if I understood that correctly. So I was just really curious about, it's something that's always struck me, this sort of absence of French fairy tales from the visual culture, from art. So I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on that.
That is interesting because I think, and 19th century England is just the greatest for illustration, for artwork. And it's true that I'm not really familiar with so much. It's almost like the Oriental, as you've written about yourself, like how important Orientalism is. And I suppose that could be connected to the popularity of the Oriental tale in the 18th century, but these other fairy tales don't quite make it there. But they were really popular on the French stage as well. So you have like a British pantomime. So that would be, the tales are mostly, so they went circulated, of course, in chapbooks and all that. But then really the 19th century, both in England and France. I know because one of the chapters is on the White Cat, which became one of the most famous French, the equivalent of pantomime. They call them féeries, they're vaudeville musicals. So there's like, and it was so famous that actually the first indoor photograph taken in a theater was of the White Cat. Which had been playing for 20 or 30 years in Paris, still filling up theaters there. And it's funny because it seems like some of the adaptations are more popular in England than in France, or like in England, you might have, like just with that one example, the White Cat, there's like maybe 10 different pantomimes that are based on the White Cat. And in France, I only find one. Mm-hmm. So, and I don't know how to explain that, but yeah, so you had like the ones that are popular in France are not necessarily the ones that are popular in England. So they kind of have parallel, but different theatrical adaptations of the tale. The other place where her tales enter into visual culture is not in painting, but in chronoliths. So like candy wrappers, or they would use her tales and Perrault's tales. The first department store, Au Bon Marché in Paris, they would give out cards that would have part of the story, an image on one side, because chronolithography, I'm learning about all of this, but it became more important in mid-19th century. There was an evolution in being able to make cheap color prints. And so then they became marketing devices. And so you do see a lot of, I have a whole collection of chocolat Poulain, chocolate from this Poulain company, where they have the tail is you have to buy a chocolate bar, you get part of the tail with the image on one side, the tail on the other, and you have to keep buying chocolate bars to get the tail. But yeah, in painting, there's almost nothing, or there might be, yeah, I don't know of anything. And if you hear of anything, let me know.
I certainly will. I will certainly keep my eye out. Yeah, I was wondering, when you mentioned the Goncourt, it made me wonder if there was some kind of faint royalist association, with these fairy tales that might have made them less popular. But, there's a whole group of royalist painters. So, that doesn't really explain it adequately.
And then it's funny because when her tales get adapted to the vaudeville theater, whether it's Paris or England, there's so much class subversion in those tales, gender and class. So I think Don Juan already has a lot of gender subversion in her tales, but she's very much, she hates the bourgeoisie. There's no social climbing in her tales. People make a distinction between Perrault, who has rise tales, where you have someone who's poor and becomes a prince, and versus restoration tales, where you have a princess who loses her status and then regains her status at the end of the tale. So Don Juan's would definitely be these restoration tales. But then when they get adapted in the popular theater, people do all kinds of really fun stuff with social class.
Yeah, amazing.
Stephen.
Thank you.
Sure. Oh, I think you're still
okay. There it is. I wasn't going to say anything because I know nothing about this at all, but no one else raising their hand, so I'll go ahead and make a couple of points. 3 points in particular. One, you began joking beforehand about the format of this, and I will confess that I thought it did have something in common with the President's State of the Union address, in that it made a big point, and I thought I knew what it was doing, and that was all great. But then you made a couple of other points, and a boring law professor might have begun the whole thing by saying, I am going to make 3 points. I'm mostly going to talk about this, but then that and that, because then we would be listening for when you switch to what you're saying. So that's one observation, okay? Second, in terms of the big point, which I take it to be that she was a really big deal, I was, very impressed and clearly persuaded and all that good stuff. But as I listened to you, I was a little bit unsure whether you were saying one thing or two things. Were you saying that she was, or maybe you're saying both, right? But they're two slightly different sort of things you might have been emphasizing. One is how well known, basically trying to prove that she was known among the people that matter. That would be one thing. And you prove that. The second would be different, which is that she influenced the writing of a number of people who mattered. And I think you said some of that stuff. And those are two slightly different things. And if you were, redoing this, you might think about whether you want to emphasize one or the other or split them up or something. And then third and last, to the extent that you are sitting out that she's a big deal, and I walk away saying, yeah, she does seem like a big deal. In the perfect world, you would say something comparative. So there was some way that a listener could say, okay, she has gotten, so many sites on Google Scholar, whereas, this person that you've all heard of has gotten only 20% more sites on Google Scholar. Whatever you're using as a metric, if there's any way to say anything comparative about whether she was, you do a great job of saying she was not a nobody, but you don't really give us a sense of where she ranks in terms of comparing her to others. And so I'm going to shut up at this point because I'm so thrilled somebody who might know something has raised a hand.
Awesome. No, thank you. No, that's really helpful. And I'm going to be reworking some of this material. There are, and I do have, and other scholars have, it's kind of like I'm bringing a lot of stuff together, but I do, and I think not just myself, but other scholars have documented the fact that Don Juan was, and I think Ruth Bodenheimer is a colleague who has a nice piece where she talks about the fact that, and some of this will go in different places in the book, like intros and conclusions, but that Don Juan was more popular in England in the 18th century and the first part of the 19th century. And later, Perrault his fairy tales become like Puss in Boots, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty. Like they're always kind of popular, but not as popular in England, for instance, as Don Juan. And so there have been some studies on that and why, and that Perrault actually, his tales were used in boys' schools, and that there's a bigger phenomenon of how women writers got excluded from literary canons, because literary canons were created for schools, which in the 18th and 19th century were mostly boys until later. And so a lot of the literature that was written by women was deemed inappropriate for boys, and Joan Dijon has written on canon formation and how. So then what happens is, if Perrault is the book that's used in grade school in Britain in 1790s, then you're going to have a generation of men growing up who might be writers and playwrights, or who want to do things, and that's their reference to the fairy tales. So in a way, so they kind of have different pathways. I think Don Juan definitely appealed to aristocratic audiences, but in England, and if Jennifer Shacker's done some amazing work on this, there are different, the frame of how the collections are presented make a big difference, whether they're presented to an aristocratic audience or a well-educated or a child audience. Sometimes it's just they change the title and change the preface to kind of frame it for that particular audience without radically changing the tales, until maybe you get to Andrew Lang at the end of the century. Linda.
So Anne, thank you so much for a really fascinating talk, and also for sharing the Zoom link so that, you know, those of us
I'm so glad you came. Good to see you.
So one of the things that really struck me in listening to your talk is, and this actually really nicely touches on the last set of comments that were just made. But one thing that really struck me was, you know, I came to fairy tales via folklore, as I know you know. And Don Juan, for me, was always had a more literary place in the canon than Perrault and the Grimms. And what really profoundly struck me in listening to your talk today was just how much my own perception of that, you know, is a product of how I came into fairy tale studies. And I think that you made a really compelling argument for how popular and popularized her work was, and your description of the chocolate things, like, okay, I mean, that's basically, you know, you go to McDonald's and collect the game pieces, right? Right. I mean,
that's a good analogy. Can I use that?
Absolutely. But I mean, that, you know, that really strikes me as putting her in the realm of where we see the way that Disney products are merchandised now. And like that is like that. I mean, this is more of a comment than a question, but that just sort of like really just sort of really blew my mind in terms of thinking about Don Juan and her work. And like, it is, you know, it is not just literary. The adaptations of that are just not, in that sense, you know, it is like, wow. Anyway, thank you.
Well, you know, actually the first chapter on Cinderella Tales looks at how one of Don Juan's versions of Cinderella made it into German and Czech oral tradition. And there's a connection between, if you follow the breadcrumbs from the translations, you know, because her tales were translated into German, and Volker Schroeder, again, my Princeton colleague, anecdota, amazing information. He just found that she was translated into German much earlier than anyone thought. So right at the beginning of the 18th century. And then, you know, so in Czech Republic, some of her tales entered oral tradition, but also were coming in through German translations. And I think a lot of scholars have noted that, like with chapbooks and things like that, even if you didn't have a highly literate population, people are going to, someone might read the story and then they'll tell other people who will tell other people. And I also think that we have a special issue on Dal Noir in Marvels and Tales right now. And there's essays by Sean Jarvis and Julie Kaler on all the German women who rewrote Dal Noir's tales. And sometimes they came from written versions, but sometimes they were the folklorization of Dal Noir's tales that had entered into German folk culture. So there's, so I do have one chapter that I kind of want to, even if the chapters might touch at one point on similar things, they'll have a different emphasis, you might say. So I have the chapter on, I have a chapter on the white cat that focuses on, now I'm forgetting what it focuses on the vaudeville pantomimes and the fairy pantomimes in France and London. And this one kind of got us to classical music. And the first chapter focuses on her relation to folk tradition, but also Three Hazelnuts for Cinderella, which is a very popular German film. And the last chapter is somehow, I haven't started writing it yet, but it's going to look at maiden warrior tales that will get us to a British board game, because one of her maiden warrior tales was made into a board game when board games were starting to circulate in the 19th century. So, Ed?
Two things. One is, was she able to write as well from being inside the convent as she was when she was outside of the convent? Or was she prohibited from writing inside the convent?
She could write. And so we think that, we don't exactly know, she was confined when, we believe she was, according to my colleague, she would have been confined when she wrote and published her first novel in 1690. And she's publishing her fairy tales in 1697 and 98, but she very likely had been working on those for years before that. But she was writing while she was confined. Absolutely. Yeah.
My other question was, is it possible to say what the theme of the white cat is?
I call it, the white cat is, I say Rapunzel meets Puss in Boots. But it's, yeah, she has very complicated, she also challenges our idea of what a fairy tale is, right? Because, but that's another story. I know we're kind of running, we're getting close, Vanessa.
Thank you.
Sure.
Following up on Stephen Calkins and some other comments and your own kind of remarks about what your book is focusing on versus what it's not. So this, if I understand correctly, you know, the main goal of this chapter, and I guess the book at large, is to kind of recover the prominence of these female authors, literateurs. Are you also interested in and to what extent will you be exploring their forgottenness and explaining how they became marginalized and are in need of recovery? So why the green becomes tricolored, and why works by female authors are excluded from the educational canon. Like, is it just because they're women, or is it because of the way people perceive their treatment of specific themes, or how much do you deal with that?
I mean, I'll probably do some of that, probably mostly in the introduction to the book, kind of setting some of that up of canon formation, because I think, and I think this is something that, our canon today is, whether it's the fairy tale canon or the literary canon, it's often, this is traditional, therefore never changing. And I guess I look at it as both recovering the voices of women who were really prominent, and these were tales, and sometimes through the process of their popularity, their name also got forgotten. So like Dal Noir's tales were published in England under Mother Bunch and Queen Mab. And so kind of, where a lot of people don't know that the Grimm's Rapunzel, for instance, is based on a German writer, and the Grimms thought it was an authentic, you know, always have to put that, was a German tale, but actually it's a translation of Mademoiselle de la Force, which is a French tale. So I think a lot of the, yeah, so I think in different ways I want to express that, but I also think that Disney plays a big role in this, because I think Disney has sort of simplified, and not just in the United States, not just in France. I was at a UN event that concerned, it was UN Women, and they created a book of fairy tales that were written by writers from Central and Eastern Europe and Asia, from like Turkey, that part of Asia, and all of their references are Disney. So I think we don't realize also the impact, like the cultural impact that has had on everyone's way of how do I conceive of a fairy tale. I think it's even worse, like, because when I was a kid, I was still reading books by the Grimms. You know, my most Rumpelstiltskin is inscribed in my brain, like I can't, you know, but I think for generations of people who grew up with DVDs and VHSs and rewatched and maybe weren't reading as much the tales. I think Disney had an impact as early as 1937. I did a study where I was looking at when did the Grimms become popular in France? It doesn't, there were scholarly editions of the Grimm's tales in France. Dolnois was being published right and left in children's books and adult books, you know, all over the place. Grimm's, then you see a little bit more towards the end of the 19th century, but no, very few single, like a book that just is the Grimm's Cinderella or the Grimm's this. But then 1937, when Snow White appears, all of a sudden you have these publications in France of Grimm's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And then there's a proliferation of that. So I think it's also kind of taking into account what Disney has done to reshape our idea of what a fairy tale is and what the canon is. And so I think it's also recovering literary fields and going back and saying things are always more complicated, and that women actually were appreciated as cultural producers. And I think that's a really important point.
Okay, thank you everyone, and thank you for presenting all those questions, and thank you so much for answering them. As far as everyone, thank you for coming, and thank you, Anne, so much for giving this talk today. The Humanities Center wanted to give you a little gift, a mask with our logo on it, and a caddy as well.
Yeah.
And as for everyone, this has been recorded. So you can find it on our website shortly after our editing process, of course, if you wanted to refer back to it for more information. So have a great rest of your day.
And thank you all for coming. I know it's I'm feeling crazy right now in this part of the semester, so thank you.
And thank you all again for coming. And I want to apologize to Jennifer. I mean, I just come back from my eye doctor whose assistant was over generous with that thing that dilates your eyes. I wasn't seeing the distinction between the clap and the raising of the hand. But you all saw the enthusiasm and the warmth and the scholarship that Anne Duggan is, and that was the sort of person I've experienced over the last 15 years or so. And thank you for that. And I'm happy to say that her work in fairy tales and Don Hasse's work, some of it was done as part of the Humanities Center Resident Scholars program. I remember Don Hasse working very diligently in that large office that we gave him, and the product is out there for the world to experience. So thank you all for coming, and hope to see you again.
Thank you, Walter.